This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hello and welcome to episode 51 of World to Win. Before we start, you already know the drill. Please subscribe to our channel and also click the bell button so you're notified whenever we upload a new video or whenever we go live. And also, just a reminder that we're also available on basically every big platform for podcasts. So if you don't have time to watch this, you can always go on any of the platforms that you would normally go to. And please subscribe because more and more people are tuning in on our podcast platforms. So it'd be good to kind of keep in touch there as well. So before we start the episode, I just want to say hello to my co-host. How are you doing, Toya?
I'm doing great, Yara, trying to survive this heat wave that we're experiencing in New England. It's unbearable.
I mean, it sounds like a nightmare. Here, I'm actually quite chilly, so I love how every time we do this, we kind of update each other on the weather.
I mean, it's insane. It's just like this with climate change, but that's not what today's episode's about, so let me not get started.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone can tell, not just, like, I don't think even if we didn't put a title on this, everyone will know what we're going to talk about today. We're obviously going to talk about the major developments that have been happening in Afghanistan. So we're going to do that, but we're going to do it in a classic World to Win way. We're going to bring a socialist analysis on Afghanistan because I think that there is something that's definitely been missing from all of the things that we've been hearing about it. So I think the main thing that we need to ask here today is what now for the Afghan people?
Yeah, we totally need to talk about that. And we also need to talk about what could have happened. I mean, here in the US, this is all people are talking about. You know, this war had been going on for 20 years. Even some of our viewers maybe have been born into this war, you know, going through school. We learned about it in the US in school. And now we're seeing, hundreds of thousands of people trying to evacuate, the, terrible pictures of people hanging on to planes, the, tragedies that have happened at the airports. And, the US was claiming that the Taliban wouldn't take over. And now, we all know what we're seeing now. It's chaos, it's panic. And so, we want to talk how we got to this point here today.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about how a lot of our viewers aren't going to remember a time where the US wasn't in Afghanistan. I think that's a major thing. Like, this has been going for so long, and I also think there's a lot of nuance to talk about here because, there's a lot, we're hearing basically every voice from the left saying something else. Some are saying shouldn't have been there in the first place. Some are saying shouldn't have left. Some are saying it's imperialism. Some are saying it's not imperialism. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from one of our World to Win veterans today. Rob, how are you doing, Rob?
I'm good. We thought that August was going to be a quiet month. At least we hope for that every year here. But of course, the events in Afghanistan have had the same effect here. People are talking about them. The government, of course, are gloating about the Americans having been defeated and giving us lectures about how the Americans shouldn't have been there in the first place. But the reality of it is, of course, that all these superpowers are gloating and arguing against each other. But the Afghan people are going through a horrific time. The people at the airport, it's one thing. You've got millions and millions of people who live in absolute dire poverty in Afghanistan. Our comrades earlier in the week got a message from women in Afghanistan who have been fighting for women's rights over the past 20 years. And one of the women commented, well, there's been demonstrations across the world in solidarity, but nothing in China or in Russia. So it was a bit of a challenge to us. We can't allow Russia to get away that easily. So our comrades organized a picket at one day's notice of the embassy. And we had a big response. There was over 1,500 people who liked the initial call. We didn't expect anywhere near that number because of repression to come. And of course, it was a relatively small one-person picket. Plenty of TV cameras there, but the police were very ruthless. As soon as comrades took their placards out, the police arrested them. 6 comrades were arrested. Two spent 2 nights in jail and were then fined around about $2,500 each, which compared to what the wages here are, is an absolutely phenomenal, crippling fine. They could have had 30 days in jail. But the response from ordinary people has been tremendous. They've been covered by all the opposition media. New people have been in touch. We found out today that a theatre director from Siberia heard about it and was so angry he's written to Putin himself to complain. So it's had a big effect that somebody has stood up, not only for women's rights here, but for women's rights in Afghanistan as well.
Wow, that's extremely inspiring. And if you are watching or listening here today and you participated in, one of these solidarity protests around the world, let us know. And solidarity to the young people in Russia who, are facing these fines. Rob, I hope everything is okay with them. So I want to get into some of this, nitty gritty talking about Afghanistan, because like Yara mentioned, we're hearing all sorts of things across the spectrum about what happened, what should have happened. And so I'm excited here to talk, a true Marxist perspective about that. And from what we've seen, the Taliban have taken the country by storm. It seemed to happen so quickly, after Biden announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops, which has been a talking point of the president's ever since I could vote. We're going to get out of Afghanistan. We're going to get out of Afghanistan. But the Taliban has taken, control extremely quickly. Rob, what is your take on this? How come nobody saw this coming? How come this couldn't have been predicted?
Well, I think it could have been predicted. I think if anybody had a sober analysis of the situation, they would have seen that the government that has been propped up in one form or another by over 20 years by US imperialism in particular, but supported by many other countries, is really it's a government with no social basis. Even in the last election last year, although Ghani won the election, it was on a turnout of less than 20%. And it's quite clear that there was no real support. The regime has been racked by corruption, undemocratic moves and so on. And over 20 years, the US in particular, but other imperialist countries have joined in with this as well. But they've spent $2.2 trillion on the intervention in Afghanistan. That was 5 times the accumulated GNP or GDP for those 20 years. If instead of putting troops in, it had been financing education, healthcare, proper jobs, the Afghan people would now be living in a relatively well-off situation. You wouldn't have the widespread poverty. You would have had probably a more popular government. And of course, the Taliban would have no basis in society because Taliban gets its support from those layers that are absolutely desperate to get out of the current situation they're faced in. Anybody who had a really sober analysis would have seen that the government that has been supported by the imperialist powers was actually a fiction. It didn't have a real basis in society. And the Taliban took over, not particularly because they were super strong, but because the government and the intervention itself was so weak and it just had no support. You could see it crumbling, that some of the warlords who in the past were part of the Northern Alliance, who fought the previous Taliban government and so on, they were prepared, if the Afghan army had agreed, to have a joint campaign against the Taliban to stop it coming to power. But then the army collapsed and the warlords fled the country because they saw no future for themselves. That really indicates how bad the situation was because of this intervention.
Thanks for that, Rob. I mean, what we're seeing here, in social media and the corporate media is this chaotic evacuation after the Taliban entered the capital, which is, reminiscent of what we saw in the 70s, during or after the war in Vietnam. The US military, which is, the largest, most funded military in the world, basically, defeated or, caught with their pants down, you might say. And it's a huge blow to this like prestige of U.S. Imperialism and its role in the region. And, we've seen reports and videos of, what actually was going on. What was the money of the U.S. military being used for in Afghanistan? What's your take on this, with kind of the status of the U.S. military and U.S. imperialism in this part of the world?
Well, yes, of course. I'm not quite old enough to remember the pictures of the evacuation from Saigon. I do remember the desperate fleeing from Tehran a decade or so later. And it really what has happened here is just one more in a long line of disasters for imperialism, in particular US imperialism in this situation. I mentioned the sum of money that the US government had spent on this war. 500 billion. That's a quarter of that money went to the banks in interest rates, which makes you ask the question: whose war was this? Whose interest was this war solving? It seems to me that some of the banks and the big arms companies were making more money out of this than the people in Afghanistan itself were having their lives saved. But I think there is another important aspect to this. The departure from Saigon in the middle of the original Cold War was a major defeat for Western imperialism. And the reality of it was a victory for the working class, because the Vietnamese war was a war against capital. It was against landlordism. It's against the feudal structures. It was fought by basically a guerrilla army. And the departure of the US was seen as the mightiest imperialist power actually being defeated by a relatively poor, backward country. And it says a lot about wars. Wars are not just fought and won by those who have the best weaponry. Wars are often fought by who has a social basis in society. But in Afghanistan, of course, we can't say. I've seen comments in social media from supposed left-wingers who are close to various communist trends, Stalinist, Maoist trends, and so on, who have been celebrating this departure. I mean, apart from the fact you can't celebrate because of the suffering of the people around the airport, it's an absolute tragedy for those people as well as for the Afghan people. But you can't celebrate it either, because what has come to power is not a more progressive government, but a feudal, reactionary, religiously extremist government that is going to attack not only any opposition movements, it's going to be devastating for women, it's going to be devastating for children, it's going to be devastating for young girls in the schools and so on. And so there's no way we should just applaud the victory against American imperialism without understanding that situation has arisen as well.
I think this is so true, and especially in the context of, how Afghanistan has basically never been a country that had any representation for the people, and just moved around from one imperialist hand to another. I think when we're seeing so many people talking about kind of like the Taliban and the rule there, it's just so incredible to see how even, the imperialist powers now would start to talk about how, they will recognize the Taliban government, the Taliban's changed, all things like that, seeing how it happens, what happens. And then, a couple of days ago, we've seen this massive terrorist attack that we already talked about a little bit. So I think my main question about this is, do we think the regime right now is going to ever find any kind of stability or legitimacy, both from the Afghani people, but also internationally?
I think let's deal with the international situation first. I mean, as I said, when we saw a wave of gloating, if you like, from America's opponents around the world, whether it was from former Stalinists or dictators like the Chinese regime or President Putin and so on, who gloated in the early days about this. But the reality of it is they are all very worried about what is going to happen. There is a feeling, and it's true, that China and Russia have been strengthened out of this, because their main opponent in the current Cold War has been weakened. But they're also very concerned that Afghanistan is going to be a source of instability on its borders. China has a border. Russia has no direct border, but it has a security agreement with the Central Asian countries and so on. Iran is worried. Turkey also doesn't have a border, but it's strengthening its wall and so on. And I heard today that Greece is doing the same to try and prepare for a wave of refugees and so on. And it's not just refugees that they're worried that will spill out. It's the idea that within Afghanistan, you could have the development of new, more extreme, even than the Taliban, extremist groups like ISIS-K, responsible for the bombing yesterday, or some of the Tajik terrorist groups that are supposed to be being strengthened in the present period. And so all these regimes are very concerned about the stability of the country, but they have no answer. But we should also remember the point that the Taliban was a direct result of the American intervention in Afghanistan when the Soviets were occupying Afghanistan. And actually, to the credit of the Soviet Union, at least they recognized secular rights in the country. There wasn't the same repression of women as then developed when the Taliban took over and then started. But the Americans built up the different Mujahideen groups, the different Muslim reactionary groups in opposition to the Soviet troops. And when the Soviet troops left, 1979, I think, 1989, I think it was, when the Soviet troops left, of course, these groups saw it as a victory. They gained confidence. They began to take over the region. They came to power. Then you had the new civil war breaking out with the Northern Alliance involved and so on. And I think this is what you're going to see now. So you will probably see splits develop in the Taliban, which will be a source of instability. You'll have the growth and strength of groups like ISIS-K, responsible for yesterday's act and so on. And you'll also have groups that are sponsored by the Chinese, by the Russians, probably by the Americans and the British, who have a long history in Afghanistan as well. And all of those groups as well will add into the mix. And we'll come to another situation where you have inter-clan, inter-ethnic civil war developing because of the inability of the government to resolve the problems.
Yara, this whole discussion and debate on Afghanistan, here in the US is very interesting to discuss, across the generations, because like we were saying before, you have people who have been radicalized by world events, but were born into this war. You had people who were adults when the war started. And then you have people like myself, the millennial generation, who we watched on TV the September 11th attack. And then, the following years we went to school and, all we talked about was this. I don't want to say all we talked about, but a lot of what we talked about was, propaganda in support of this war. We would say the Pledge of Allegiance, like we always did, but then sometimes we would follow off by, singing this ridiculous song about how I still remember all the words, I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. Those were the words that we were singing, because one of the ideas that they were trying to push on us was that we were liberating women. In Afghanistan, the women have to cover their faces. They have to cover their hair. They're not allowed to go to school. We're going there to liberate them. This was a way to get us supporting this, and then 2008, 2009 happens. People lose their jobs. And my generation, we then joined the war that's been going on for almost a decade to continue to liberate women. Women have been in the US a central part of this, war machine propaganda. And so the situation that we're seeing now where, women have been and are going to be, attacked and their rights taken back it's as a woman especially, it's very scary, situation to think about.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I think it's really important, when people say that, because I've heard it all the time. Obviously, growing up in Israel and Palestine, it's the propaganda about this war in Iraq as well has been constantly, pumped in schools, pumped on TV, and the idea of we're liberating women and that's why it's a good war has been constant. And I think that the point that Rob made actually before about how the US actually funded the, you know, forefathers of the Taliban. It's not like the Taliban came out of nowhere. They were supported by the US government, and that regime, you know, that was so oppressive to women was actually supported originally or built through US funding. So saying that the US is liberating women in Afghanistan is obviously ridiculous, and it's never we can't, you know, have this illusion that in any way liberating women was the reason to enter Afghanistan. But like, yeah, we do need to kind of point out the fact that there was kind of like an increase in women's rights after the Taliban were taken down by the US entry. But saying that women were liberated is far from the truth. You know, like we've seen, you know, sexual violence, gender violence, oppression, still extremely widespread. It's not like, you know, the troops came in and liberated women and now everyone's happy and free. And I think it's really important that we kind of stress the role that the US had in getting the Taliban to where it was in the first place, and also mention that even though there were some, you know, benefits for women's rights, there's still wide oppression of women in Afghanistan, and there was before the Taliban took power again.
Yeah, and I think another thing we should think about is, you know, just this role of internationalism that we've seen over the past few years, especially with this pandemic, this new consciousness that we're seeing among young people, especially of international solidarity, I think is so important. You know, and like Rob mentioned earlier with the solidarity protests happening around the world, I think, you know, now more than ever, a strong women's movement is needed to talk about, educate, and fight back against atrocities like this. And so Rosa International just put out a statement about it. You can find it in the link below. It's really great. Share it. And if you do, you know, some solidarity protests about the conditions of women, about the refugee crisis, please let us know and post them to social media, tag Rosa International so we can share them around the world.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. You know, like when we think now where kind of women's struggle generally is compared to 1996, which is when the Taliban first got hold of Afghanistan, you can't even compare the situation. And I think that also gave kind of like the kind of force for the Taliban to completely, like entirely kind of repress and oppress women. But now they're in a different situation. You know, we are seeing that ridiculous PR campaign where they're going like, oh, we're going to give women rights. We're going to respect women's rights. And it's on the one hand ridiculous to see the Taliban claiming that they're going to do that. And obviously we shouldn't have any illusions in that. But it's also an interesting point for us as Marxists to see how this kind of backdrop of, like you said, this global resistance, this global women's movement, how that is actually making even the most, you know, repressive governments and organizations in the world have to make certain changes. But I want to ask Rob this, is it big enough of a change to say that the Taliban's really changed and now we're going to see, you know, a new era of the Taliban?
Yes, I think there is another important point here, that in the West we read, as you've both just said, about the war being in defense of women's rights and so on, liberation of women. But it has been an improvement of women's rights for a fairly restricted layer of Afghan women. Those who live in the cities, some of them are in parliament, there's a deputy president and so on, who have won positions in the past period. But the liberation of women, for the vast majority of women who live away from Kabul and in the countryside areas, hasn't had any effect at all. You have 43%, only 43% of the population are literate, and the proportion is even lower amongst women. You've had continued attacks against women. 390 women have been killed in Kabul this year, through well, I want to call it domestic violence, but that's not the right word. But the general oppression of women that comes from this religious domination and so on. You have 55% of the population live without clean water, even more without proper sanitation. And of course, in those conditions, you can't talk about women being liberated in any sense. It's a small proportion. Has the Taliban changed? Well, I heard an example that Taliban militants in Kabul were heard using taking selfies on mobile telephones and telling each other to watch the Twitter reports that are coming through. Well, in that sense, the Taliban has changed, because when it had power before, telephones were banned. People weren't allowed to use them. So certainly there's been a certain change. I think the situation now is that after 20 years of struggle, particularly by women, women are no longer going to accept a new Taliban repression of women. And in the cities, the Taliban will probably be forced to be more liberal, because otherwise they'll face too much opposition. But in the countryside, and Afghanistan is mainly country, mainly rural areas, you will find that the Taliban is just as bad as it was before, just as religious, just as anti-women as it was before. Taliban today have said, apparently, according to Al Jazeera, that it is going to form a new inclusive government in which there will be different ethnic groups and so on, which is what all the imperialist powers have been asking for. But if it cannot solve one of the single economic issues, it can't resolve this situation of the economy. It certainly won't be able to resolve the question of rights of women, democratic rights of youth and so on. It's going to find no stability on that arena either. And I think that, notwithstanding the shock that you've heard in the mainly in the Western press during the week, in the pro-capitalist press during the week, that Taliban have come to power, they'll consolidate their position. The Taliban has changed. I think that is another wishful thinking illusion, if that's the right phrase to use. They're hoping against hope that things aren't going to be so bad. So if the Taliban then say, well, we're going to allow women to be represented in parliament, they can teach, they can work in the health service, which is what they're saying at the moment, although I don't think many people believe that that is really going to happen. That's actually not going to be that much different from what happens anyway at the current position. But it's going to leave the vast majority of women again in Afghanistan in a dire situation. So yes, I think Yara said made the point about international solidarity. We have a major campaign in order to support people who are in Afghanistan fighting for their rights. They exist. There are many of them. I read the phrase this week that what was the phrase? That we are not stoppable. And I think that's something that should give us encouragement, that there are already people beginning to prepare to resist the new Taliban regime.
So, Rob, we've talked a lot about, what has happened. We even went into a little bit of the history, starting in the late 80s, early 90s. And, we're talking about the situation we're in now. The war is one thing, the Taliban takeover is another, but we still have issues of poverty. We still have issue of, less than 5% of the population in Afghanistan is vaccinated from COVID-19, which has been a theme of a lot of the things we've talked about, on this show, but we haven't really touched on today. But what can we do going forward? What is the way forward for the people of Afghanistan, even though they're in this situation that was created by things outside of their control?
Well, of course, many people look on this situation as if we have to go in from the outside to solve the problems of the Afghan people. But the reality of it is the solution of the situation in Afghanistan is the responsibility in the first place of the Afghan people. It's needed. If I was there, I would be arguing now for the building of a mass movement against the Taliban. And I would have on the banner, not just we're against the Taliban, but I would link it to all the question of economic and social rights, of proper living standards, of taking over the natural resources. It's reported this week that in Afghanistan, there is something like $1 trillion worth of minerals that could be exploited. I'm using that word cautiously because at the moment it's the Chinese, and particularly the Chinese are looking to exploit it, because there's a lot of lithium in Afghanistan, which of course is used in electric cars. It's a key component of the batteries and so on. So you can imagine that the Chinese companies are licking their lips already, thinking, how can we get our hands on this stuff? Well, that should be the property of the Afghan people. You should have a mass movement that should take over all those natural resources, to start to use them to build proper homes, proper schools, proper healthcare, and so on. And of course, if that was to happen, you would have central to that, of course, would be what trade unions that do exist. There are a few, they're very weak, they're very, very repressed and so on. And I think in the last couple of years, they've not been particularly active. But if things begin to develop in that way, you could see new trade unions develop. You have a women's movement that could develop. The youth movement through the universities and so on could provide a powerful force. And then our task would not be to go in and tell them how to do this and how to do that. Our task would be to give them solidarity and to make sure that they're not isolated in Afghanistan. We need to be able to build strong socialist organizations in the other countries of that region, in Pakistan, in Iran, in Central Asia and so on, in China, of course, where our comrades are heroically working away to maintain some form of organization. And that is the best way that we could help, by offering assistance and solidarity and working together with people who are prepared to fight within the country.
Thank you so much, Rob. This has been so interesting, and I have to say that I feel like I know a lot more about what's happening in Afghanistan now, because, you know, we keep saying, well, a lot of us don't remember a time when the US wasn't in Afghanistan. I was 6 years old when the invasion happened, so this is really helpful in understanding the context of it, and also what the socialist position is about this. And I think the last points that you made were extremely, powerful, because, as you said, it's very easy for us to kind of dismiss the questions of what can the Afghan people do, and what is good for the Afghan people. And I think that it's really important that we talk about kind of the solidarity in the region and the people fighting for an actual, system that will sustain them properly and not leave them to the kind of whims of the imperialist powers. So thank you so much for being here. But before you leave, I know we mentioned it a few times in this episode, but the shout out of the week this week is going to be for the protests in Russia, where our comrades were arrested, and these were exactly the protests that we talked about now. So there's obviously the level of, say, repression in Russia, Rob talked about it a little bit before, is incredible. And it's always really inspiring to hear what our members do in Russia despite this level of repression. But it also means that we need to get solidarity internationally for them when things like being arrested happen. So, Rob, what can we do as an international, as the people watching, as our viewers? What can we do to help in this case?
Well, I think the response of internationally on Sunday night and Monday morning after these, on Monday night and Tuesday morning after the arrest took place was a key example of what can be done. First of all, Mick Barry, for example, phoned at the earliest opportunity the Russian embassy in Dublin, raised the issue with them. Comrades in other parts of the world have contacted the embassies. They've sent solidarity photographs and so on. And they've certainly shown a lot of concern for the comrades, and even just sending them messages of support so that their enthusiasm, their morale is kept up and so on. Of course, here, whenever anybody is arrested, we have people outside the police stations. We make sure that they get food, they get clothing they need. If possible, they get a battery for the telephone if they can use it and so on. So we always back it up. And there are organizations here that provide them with legal advice. So as soon as somebody is arrested, an advocate turns up at the police station. usually give me very, very good advice. Sometimes maybe the advice is not as good as we would like it to be, but nevertheless, it is there. And it's a general solidarity. But the other thing that I think is extremely important is we don't need to be isolated. Comrades who are fighting in countries like China, in Russia, in Belarus, people who are fighting, for example, in Afghanistan, Myanmar, where maybe we don't have organizations in the ISA. But the key thing is that they feel the solidarity from other countries. And if this solidarity is going to have any purpose, it's to build a strong organization in each country that can fight for a socialist change. And so one of the key issues in all these solidarity campaigns is to treat them as political issues and to make sure that they are used to build the forces of socialism in your own country. And I think the example of the Chinese Hong Kong solidarity campaign, the International has set up is a brilliant example of that. It's used politically to help build the organizations in the other countries, as well as to give solidarity to the comrades who are struggling in China, Hong Kong, and so on.
I think this is a great point, because obviously if you can organize the solidarity protests and do whatever you can, this is so good. But I think that the main thing is to join us. It's to build this organization that has this international solidarity at its core, not just when something happens, but generally, because the situation is global, the system is global, the situation is global. So we have to fight against it together. And I would also encourage everyone to contact us to join, but also if you have the ability to donate even a few euros, a few dollars, a few pounds, whatever currency you're using, to the International Socialist Alternative. We are trying to build this China-Hong Kong solidarity campaign that Rob just talked about, and of course support our members everywhere around the world, but especially in these places where it's much more risky to take the action that we need to take everywhere around the world right now. So thank you so much to Rob and obviously Toya and everyone who's been listening. This was really brilliant. I'm sure everyone's enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time, next week, same time and same place. Bye-bye.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!